Good afternoon. It is a minute past 3 p.m. here in Nairobi. It's African time. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you're tuned in and watching us from. The show is Diaspora Dispatches, and I'm here to bring you the latest news from across the continent of Africa. And we shall start our bulletin this afternoon from Botswana, where Botswana's former president Ian Khama has vowed to vigorously campaign to dethrone his hand-picked successor, Mokwetsi Masisi, now a bitter rival from whom he accuses of being a threat to democracy in next year's election. The 70-year-old Khama governed one of Africa's most stable democracies and its top diamond-producing nation for a decade until 2018, before handing the reins to Masisi, then who was his deputy. South Africa-based Khama now accuses Masisi, who is 60 years old, of authoritarianism and has said he regrets having appointed him as his successor. Khama landed in South Africa in November 2021 to meet Nigerian ex-leader and respected continental mediator Olusegun Obasanjo, who was trying to intervene to bridge the rift between both men. The row between the pair started immediately after Khama resigned in 2018 at the end of his constitutional limit of 2 5-year terms, when Masisi started reversing some key policies adopted during Khama's tenure. Months later, and in the run-up to the last elections, Khama dramatically quit the long-ruling Botswana Democratic Party, which had been co-founded by his father, Seretse Khama, Botswana's first president. With elections due next year, Khama is preparing to return home to bolster the opposition into a coalition to remove Masisi through the ballot. And of course, both Masisi and the government spokesperson have not responded to the request for a comment on Khama's claims. But also during an interview in one of South Africa's TV stations, he also said that Khama, the former president, said that the current president of Botswana has intentions of killing him when he goes back to Botswana. Quite interesting. Now the latest on the Vice President of the US's visit. And Vice President Kamala Harris on Tuesday stepped through the black doors of a colonial-era seaside fort and down into the dungeons, touring a site where millions of enslaved Africans were held captive before they were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. With her first visit to Cape Coast Castle, Harris was insisting on remembering the painful past, even as she stood earlier Tuesday before a monument commemorating Ghana's independence, envisioning a grand future between the U.S. and Africa propelled by innovation on the continent. The nation's first black and South Asian vice president is the most high-profile member of the President Joe Biden's administration to visit Africa, and the U.S. escalates its outreach to the continent. The events on her second day in Ghana are part of a week-long trip that will include visits to Tanzania and Zambia. Cape Coast Castle is one of the dozens of fortresses in West Africa that held slaves, many of them in Ghana. The government here has viewed preserving them as part of its historical responsibility. Harris kept her prepared remarks to talk bluntly about the anguish that reeks from the place and the horrors endured by the people who passed through those walls: mass kidnapping, sicknesses, rape and death. Those who lived were sold into bondage in the Americas during their tour. Harris and husband dog Emoff walked past a plaque commemorating a visit by Barack and Michelle Obama, the nation's first black president and first lady. The couple walked along the stone ramparts flanked by cannons, pausing to gaze out over the sea as waves crashed on the rock shore below. She passed through the white archways and down a darkened pathway leading through the infamous door of no return, through which slaves left the coast and never came back. Harris choked back tears, her hand on her mouth. As she approached, she placed a white bouquet of flowers given to her during the arrival ceremony of the entrance to a women's dungeon nearby. Harris has proved to be a potent messenger in Ghana, as thousands waited hours earlier Tuesday at Independence Square for a chance to see her speak at the Black Stone Gate Monument. Very well, then we head over to Libya. The European Union on Tuesday defended its record of helping migrants in Libya after UN-backed investigators accused the 27-nation bloc of encouraging human rights abuses and other crimes in this North African country. Libya is an important jumping-off point for people from North Africa and beyond who wish to make the perilous crossing to the Mediterranean Sea in a poorly maintained boats in search for a better life or refuge in Europe. According to the United Nations International Organization for Migration, IOM, at least 529 migrants died and 848 others went missing off the coast of Libya last year. More than 24,680 people were intercepted by the Libyan Coast Guard as they attempted to leave the country and then brought back. Presenting the report of the United Nations fact-finding mission to Libya about Libya on Monday, investigator Chelo Kabayani said EU assistance to the Libyan authorities, the Immigration Department and the Coast Guard helped and encouraged the commission of these crimes, including crimes against humanity. The report states that the migrants, some of whom could have been granted asylum or apprehended, detained and disembarked in Libya with the sole aim of preventing their entry into Europe as a corollary of the European policy of immigration and the economic agenda of migration in Libya through their subsequent detention and exploitation. The European Commission, the EU's executive body, said it took the allegations very seriously while stressing that it works with Libya for essential and often carried out in coordination with the United Nations agencies such as IOM and the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. The report also states that investigators believe that EU and its member countries provided directly and indirectly financial and technical support as well as equipment such as boats to the Libyan Coast Guard and the Directorate to fight against illegal migration, which have been used to intercept and detain migrants. However, Mr. Stano refuted suggestions that the EU could pay to keep migrants in Libya. And earlier this month, the Commission said a new boat had recently been handed over to the Coast Guard. 2 more new boats and an undisclosed number of refurbished boats are yet to come. All right, so we head over to Lesotho. And Lesotho's parliament is expected today to discuss a motion on the reclamation of some parts of South Africa. An opposition member of parliament wants legislators to declare the whole of Free State, parts of the Northern Cape, parts of the Eastern Cape, parts of Mpumalanga and parts of KwaZulu-Natal as parts of Lesotho's territory, according to Parliament's order paper. It says the reclamation will be pursued under the United Nations Resolution 1817 that was passed by the General Assembly in December 1962. Historically, Lesotho people were found in South Africa's Orange Free State, Eastern Cape, Northern Cape, Mpumalanga and parts of KwaZulu-Natal, but they were forced to move to present-day Lesotho because of migration during wars. Interesting. And then we head over to Nigeria, and this time the Nigerian civil society organizations have been holding daily protests to pressure the Independent and National Electoral Commission, INEC, and Nigerian authorities to review the February and March elections. The presidential and gubernatorial and parliamentary polls were marred by violent attacks leading to deaths, injuries, voter suppression and intimidation. On Monday, police said more than 700 people had been arrested for disrupting elections and will be prosecuted. According to the law, as music filled the air, protesters in civil society group Free Nigerian Movement held placards and marched in the streets of the capital on Tuesday. Daily demonstrations began last week to call for accountability in the electoral system. Nigerians went to the polls in February and March and to elect a new president. State governors and lawmakers. Observers say the elections were characterized by widespread violence, voter suppression and intimidation, as well as technical problems. Protesters say INEC was too quick to declare winners despite the obvious challenges. They also say the commission failed to honor its promise to electronically transmit results during the presidential polls. Bola Ahmed Tinubu, who was declared the winner of February's presidential elections, I think has since asked the opposition and others to just move on and accept those results. And then we head over to South Africa, which now seems to be in a quagmire, but I wonder if really this is a problem for South Africa. But With an international criminal court arrest warrant out for Vladimir Putin, South Africa is weighing what to do if the Russian president accepts an earlier invitation to attend an August summit in the country. The court in The Hague issued an arrest warrant for the Russian leader on March the 17th for war crimes, including the deportation of the Ukrainian children to Russia. South Africa is a signatory to the ICC's Rome Statute that obligates countries to execute the court's international arrest warrants. But Pretoria is also a very close ally with Moscow and has refrained from criticizing Russia's 2022 invasion into Ukraine, going as far as holding bilateral talks with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov earlier this year and hosting Russian warships in February for joint military exercises. Naledi Pandor, South Africa's Minister for International Relations, told local radio station SAFM in an interview that the government was awaiting a refreshed legal opinion on the matter and would then consider its options. However, the minister demurred on the possibility of withdrawing Putin's invitation to the summit of the group of emerging economic powers known as BRICS that consist of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. South Africa is due to host a summit of the bloc's leaders in this August. Moscow has not yet confirmed whether Putin will attend in person. Pandor also criticized the ICC for not having what she called an even-handed approach to all leaders responsible for abuses of international law and for focusing on some states rather than others. But Darren Bergman, Shadow Minister for International Relations with South Africa's main opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, said the government must stick by its ICC commitments and make sure they apprehend President Vladimir Putin just in case he shows up for that summit in South Africa in August. Very well, and then we end with some news from South Sudan. And President Salva Kiir has directed the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation to clear the rental arrears for diplomatic missions and regional fees. Over the past year, Juba has been struggling to maintain its foreign missions over alleged financial constraints. In 2015, South Sudan had 25 functioning embassies across the world and had plans to open more as a way of improving the country's engagement and relations with other countries. But in the years that followed, the embassies experienced a reduction in the number of personnel while others faced evictions over unpaid rent. The government said each foreign mission had between 20 to 25 staff with non-essential workers, which increases salaries and other operational costs. The Foreign Affairs Ministry said it would continue to review the status of its then 39 embassies and consulates before deciding on the number to be closed in June 2019. The government announced plans to close South Sudan's embassies in France, Norway, Ghana, Kuwait and Italy, among others due to economic crisis. The decision was criticized by political commentators who believed it could lead to international isolation of South Sudan. 2 months later, President Salva Kiir abandoned the decision to close down foreign missions in some European countries. In June 2020, the African Union sanctions South Sudan over outstanding contributions to the continental body as part of member contributions to the continent. A country is expected to annually pay its membership fee. But at that time, South Sudan did not pay its contributions amounting to about $9 million to the AU budget and peace funds for 3 years. And South Sudan is also believed to have a lot of unpaid arrears to regional, international and global bodies it subscribes to. Addressing members of parliament during the inauguration of the first session of the legislature in Juba yesterday, President Salva Kiir directed the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to address the matter. He said all the outstanding arrears should be cleared, and he also directed the Foreign Affairs Ministry to lobby for the lifting of the arms embargo against South Sudan and address the unresolved border issues between the country and some parts of the neighbors. All right, so you are now up to date. South Sudan, we have not talked about South Sudan for the last couple of days, and South Sudan has been struggling. South Sudan has been struggling with especially its payment. I think it's diplomatic missions, and I think as I was just going through that story, I think I mentioned there's a time they had considered to close down some, some of their, submissions. some offices, some embassies across the world, because South Sudan was being very practical, because it realized it could not afford to take care of the bills, which I think is in order. I think sometimes you have to be very practical in how you handle these matters and see, is it something that is it something that the country is able to take care of. But I don't know why some of the members of parliament there are complaining over South Sudan being isolated if it closes down some of its missions abroad, because one, perhaps they don't understand. They can have one, they're allowed to have one, maybe one ambassador, say based here in Kenya, that can also represent South Sudan in Uganda, in Tanzania, in Rwanda, in as many countries as is possible. And in those other countries, they just put up consulates, like smaller offices, right? But they're allowed. So by this member saying that for South Sudan to, and this is contained in the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations of 1961, also Vienna Conventions on consular relations that was improvised also in 1963. So these are things, this is something that actually South Sudan can do. Sometimes if you don't, or even they can appoint somebody within that country or any other country that resides in a certain country to be, to represent South Sudan. All right, to take up, I can't remember the exact titles, but they could, for instance, here in South Sudan, they can decide to pick on any, even just a normal citizen, either Kenyan or not Kenyan, to represent the interests of South Sudan in Kenya. It is allowed under this the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations of 1961. And so by these members of parliament saying that if South Sudan closed these offices, then South Sudan's presence around will be isolated. That is not true. That is not true, because there are other means and there are ways. And I think in this, in that regard, I think the president of South Sudan and the government of South Sudan was just trying to be practical and to be realistic with the fact that they can't afford to pay all these diplomatic missions, all these embassies, to pay their rent and to sustain their running in these different countries around the world. So South Sudan was just being was just making a smart move at that time. Of course, after the criticism, President Salva Kiir seems to have pulled back, but closed a few perhaps. But it is possible. You can have an ambassador in one region that represents, that is able to represent your country and still be ambassador in neighboring countries or whichever country that you want them to work on. But usually it's if the receiving countries don't have a problem with this person or don't have a problem with that arrangement, they might refuse. They might refuse for whatever reason. And usually if a receiving countries refuses to accept your ambassador, then the sending country really does not have a say in that. You just go back and then bring somebody else that is acceptable to the receiving country, and they don't even have to give an explanation as to why they don't want your ambassador, that particular person in their country, okay? We've seen that happen in Burkina Faso. We've seen that happen in Mali when they asked for the France ambassador to leave. France tried to engage diplomatically, did not bear any fruits, and so France did not have a choice but to have these people leave and then perhaps bring somebody else that is acceptable to their receiving country. So that is also there. So as long as this person that you intend to oversee your embassies in these different countries is acceptable by these receiving countries, then it is fine. They can oversee your embassies in 3, 4, 5 countries, depending on the amount of interest. You will be surprised. A lot of, especially what I've realized, the Middle East countries, even in Kenya here, there are others who really don't have an embassy here, apart from maybe the major countries like, Saudi Arabia, like, do they have a full embassy or a consulate? I'm not sure, but there are others who just have one ambassador for East Africa, and then they have all these consulates now across Africa with lesser mission there. Because the reason why some of them choose to do this, even though they can afford it, is because perhaps maybe Kenya is not a country they have a lot of interest in, but for the sake of just maintaining a diplomatic relation, just in case, then they will place a smaller mission there, a consulate there. But usually it's when the reasons why, if they don't have, as a sending country does not have a lot of interest in that country, they don't do so much trade or things like that, like their diplomatic relations is not as robust, that requires a whole embassy to be set up in a country, which can be extremely expensive, and maybe, it's not worth it. So even for those who can afford to maintain and run that, they sometimes opt to just have one ambassador take care of their affairs in a given region, representing the presence of that country there in different countries. But also now for South Sudan's case, when now a country is having financial troubles, and I think this would have been a very smart move for South Sudan. So for President Salva Kiir to order for the Foreign Affairs to go clear the rental, the salary arrears of diplomatic missions, he knows very well South Sudan is broke. So where does the Foreign Affairs Ministry expected to get this money? And if they do have this money, why have they allowed for these arrears to accumulate? Why have they allowed for the diplomatic missions of South Sudan in foreign countries to suffer? That the president has to direct them for them to do something about it and go clear their arrears and pay the staff, because some of them have been going for months and others even years without receiving their payments. And some of these embassies and facilities that they've rented out in those receiving countries of South Sudan has not been able to pay. So the assumption has been South Sudan has been having financial problems. So that is one of the reasons why. But when you hear President Salva Kiir ordering for these arrears to be cleared and for these monies to be paid, has this been money being just sitting somewhere and somebody has been refusing to make these payments? Or what is happening? Does it have to take the president to give these orders for these arrears, rental arrears, salary arrears for South Sudan's foreign missions staff to be paid? Was its money just somewhere? Or now the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has to go around and look for this money and pay? I don't know, but anyway, it's just a little diplomatic lesson there for you. So anyway, South Africa had its problems, and the arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. I don't know, but what I see happening, I know Putin will come just to prove a point. I know he will come to South Africa just to prove a point, and I know South African authorities will not arrest him, but I know a person that perhaps will be used by the West to cause mayhem and organize protests in South Africa, and you know who that person is. And you've already had the official opposition party in South Africa, Democratic Alliance. They're saying no way. The government has to stick and has to respect its commitment to the ICC. So if Vladimir Putin shows up in South Africa, according to the opposition, then he is expected to be arrested. I don't think that will be the case at all. And I think President Putin will show up in South Africa just because, to show you that he can, and there's nothing you can do about it, international community, just to stick a finger to your face, and there's nothing you can do about it. I think he will just show up for that, just to irritate the Western powers. I think he will do that. I think he'll just do that. But I don't see a situation, I don't envision a situation where South Africa will just decide, to arrest Putin. Or South Africa might decide to have a diplomatic conversation behind the scenes and tell Putin, you know what, as much as we do value your relationship and our cooperation and our diplomatic relations, that is fantastic, but also we have to consider other factors and other people that we also cooperate with in this international system, and perhaps you coming to South Africa this time might not be a very good idea, and this warrant of arrest over your head, as ridiculous as this is, and all that Putin doesn't deserve it, but I think in the manner in which it was issued and the grounds, I think it's just ridiculous, so it might mean that you might want to send a high-level official from Russia, but not you in particularly, so that also could be the case. But I highly suspect, and I could be wrong, August is still a few months away, but I highly suspect Putin will just show up just for the sake of showing up, just to show the West that, yes, South Africa is, we have better relations compared maybe to you guys, so I think so, but anyway. So the civil society in Nigeria, they're protesting over election outcome, and they're asking for the elections that took place in February, that is the presidential elections, and others, the governorship, and also the ones that elected the members of parliament. They're asking for the elections to be cancelled because of the problems that were exhibited during the elections that I think we've talked about here so much, so I will not get into the details of it. Last week we were looking through the petition that was filed in the courts to challenge the presidential win results, and to be honest with you, I don't see Atiku Abubakar and also Peter Obi and the other two, I don't know their names, who filed this case to challenge this win. How they highlighted those issues was not weighty enough. Really, Atiku filed first, and then Obi repeated what Atiku said. So it's just the same thing. They should have put up just one appeal together. It's just the same thing. I've not gone through what the other two people have filed challenging the results, but it's really, I don't know. I don't know if it might convince the courts to it might convince the court to cancel that victory for Tinubu, but it's not very strong case there. I went through it. I mean, it's just, in fact, when you go through, it's just very lazy. Let me just say that the points, and I'm not even a lawyer. I have very limited, understanding of how perhaps that works, but I do understand law just a little bit, but it's not weighty. It is not weighty at all. So, but I can't wait to see how that will play out in the courts there in Nigeria, and maybe then we can talk about it. Perhaps the defense, the oral submission, and the extra information that shall be submitted during that proceedings perhaps will bear some weight. But as it is now, I don't know. It's just Anyway, Lesotho's parliament today is expected to discuss a motion on the reclamation of parts of South Africa. I don't know where this case is going, or I don't know if they will, after they are through with discussing this, so they want to have parts of Northern Cape, part of Eastern Cape, and parts of Mpumalanga, as well as KwaZulu-Natal, and they're going back to history. It says that the reclamation will be pursued under the United Nations Resolution 1817 that was passed by the General Assembly in 1962. Okay, so they're saying parts of their people, the Lesothos, they lived in these parts that have been taken over by South Africa. So now they'll be asking to have these parts, back to Lesotho. I don't know how this is going to work here. But I will be interested also to see how that will work for them. So, okay, so we'll just leave that there. Now, the issue of Botswana, I'll talk about it in the morning. I'll not really dwell so much on that because it's a story I love sharing here. Botswana, the former president and the current one, but we'll not talk about it right now. So let's look at this Libyan very quickly in 2 minutes' time. The European Union on Tuesday defended its record of helping migrants. I love this, how these Western-backed institutions are now going ham on these Western powers and how they've been operating and handling issues in the international system. The things that we talk about here. If you were watching the morning show and you were looking at the report by Amnesty International, and they were really pointing fingers at the Western powers on how they handle certain issues, and the issues to do with migration and the double standards when it comes to migrants from one part of the world, especially from Africa and from Syria and Afghanistan, and how they handled refugees, basically refugees from, say, Ukraine when the war has been happening, and since it started, there was quite a disparity. And, you know, they pointed out this obvious, and how now they're pushing for Russia to be, the President Vladimir Putin to be arrested, and pointing at the heights of human rights abuses that are ongoing under Russia's watch, and Russia is participating in this. But Amnesty International is saying, wait, Saudi Arabia has been doing the same in Yemen. Israel has been doing the same for the Palestinians there in the Gaza Strip and around those occupied East Jerusalem. You know, but you've not said much. You don't seem to hold them accountable as much as you want to hold Vladimir Putin accountable. And they cited practical examples that we talk about here every now and then. And so now it is the United Nations that is pointing a finger now to the European Union. Now, these are the kinds of stories that warm my heart. And they're saying, wait, you are the ones who are supporting Libya, the authorities, I think the side that is backed by the United Nations, in committing these atrocities on the migrants who are trying to cross over to the Mediterranean. I think they have a working relations, the European Union and Libya, so that to stop the migration from Africa into Europe. So they work with Libya, and in the manner in which these things are done are really quite inhumane. When you hear stories of how these things happen, you know, when you watch these even documentaries, and it will just depress you, and how these things happen. They even have a slavery market. I think we once saw it on, I think CNN did that story, and I could not bring myself to fully watch it because I think I would have been traumatized. But it is traumatizing. And what the United Nations-backed investigators are saying, are accusing the 27-member bloc, the whole of European Union, and they are saying that you were wrong for this. You are the ones who were aiding Libya and aiding and giving it money and ways in which, you know, it is oppressing these people, in which it is causing harm over these migrants, these refugees who are running away from their countries, who, you know, perhaps even face grave dangers being in their countries, and all they want is just to get a place that is safer, that their lives are not threatened. And they're saying they're actually people who have legit reasons, valid reasons for running away, but that will not be heard at all. And so I think this is quite amazing. This is quite refreshing. I like it when it's not just a whitewashing and you know, and all these things that happen, and you know, fingers are normally pointed elsewhere, but the culprits and the people who are perpetrators of these things, as we know them, they never get to be blamed. So I like that it is the United Nations investigators who are blaming EU. I love that it is Amnesty International, an organization from the West, that is now establishing and is now telling the world how the West are hypocrites in how they handle these issues of human rights. And these are the things they champion, and, you know, they claim to be operating within, but they do the same. They do the same. So I love it. I love it so much. And so one of the officials says, of course, from the EU, they say they don't fund any Libyan entity. We don't give physical money to our partners in Libya. What we do is allocate a lot of money, which is then generally used for our international partners. A lot of it goes through the United Nations, for example. So they give this money to stop the immigration going up there. So it's quite interesting. Yeah, it's quite interesting. But, you know, they've come out to vehemently deny that report by the United Nations-backed investigators. So this is the UN, so you can't tell us otherwise. You know, you can't tell us otherwise. So that is it. So EU and Western powers, you better change your ways. You better change your ways, because this is not it. So we are apprehended, detained, disembarked in Libya with the sole aim of preventing their entry into Europe. Part of the report read, these refugees, as a European policy on immigration and the economic agenda of migration in Libya through their subsequent detention and exploitation. And the European Commission, EU's executive body, said it took the allegations very seriously while addressing that it works in Libya. Its work in Libya was essential and often carried out in coordination with the United Nations agency. So it is the same United Nations agency that you work with that is now saying, you know, is now accusing you of these grave matters. So you change your ways. All right, I think that is where we shall end our show this afternoon. That story of Kamala and Masisi, I think we'll talk about it tomorrow, God willing. I want to thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your day. This has been Diaspora Dispatches. Bye-bye.